Ann Taylor's office.
It's like there was never anything here but jungle.
Welcome back to the True Crime Jungle. Today we'll be examining the defense of Bryan Kohberger. We'll be exploring the limitations of using touch DNA to establish guilt, the holes in the timeline, including the cell phone data and the footage of the car. There are a lot of questions surrounding the reliability of evidence against Bryan Kohberger. And I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what Ann Taylor might be using as her defense. So let's jump right into it.
As accused murderer Bryan Kohberger awaits trial, we're taking a closer look at the woman representing him in the high-profile case.
Who is Ann Taylor, and what does she bring to the table for the defense of Bryan Kohberger?
I do find that you are indigent and do qualify for court-appointed counsel. I will appoint Ms. Taylor to represent you in this case.
At Kohberger's initial appearance in Latah County, Idaho last week, 57-year-old Ann Taylor, the Kootenai County Chief Public Defender, was appointed his counsel. Kootenai County is about an hour and a half north of Latah County. Experts we spoke to say Latah County only has 4 public defenders and 2 recused themselves. On top of that, it's common in an underfunded public defender's office for an out-of-county public defender to be brought in if needed. Back in 2017, Taylor started work as the Chief Public Defender for Kootenai County and worked with the office before that between 2004 and 2012. In the interim, Taylor spent 5 years at a private practice where she specialized in criminal defense. The Idaho native received her doctorate from Idaho State University in 1998 and has since practiced law on the local, state, and federal levels. While Kohberger's case may be Taylor's most high-profile one yet, she previously defended Jonathan Ellington, whose case gained notoriety at the state level. Ellington was given a combined sentence of 55 years for second-degree murder and aggravated battery convictions. Taylor helped overturn the case, arguing an Idaho police officer committed perjury in the trial and citing prosecutorial misconduct.
Just who was Bryan Kohberger? Was he really just a creepy incel, as so often described?
One friend who used to jog with Kohberger, stunned.
I would have never thought something like this would be accused of him.
There's nothing to suggest that this guy has ever suffered from a psychotic disorder. Doesn't mean that he never did experience these symptoms. And it's certainly possible that maybe that there were some things that happened in his past, traumas, abuses, right? Obsessive compulsive disorders, autism spectrum disorders. The list can go on and on and on of how many things that this person could potentially use, but there's nothing that we've seen so far to indicate that that has occurred.
Clouded in mystery since day one, there has never been much confidence in a suspect or faith in the investigation as a whole.
More than a month into this investigation, and police have yet to identify a suspect.
So I think the strongest and probably the only option here is it wasn't him. I mean, today everyone is applauding the police and their investigation and the capture of Bryan Kohberger, but don't forget, a week ago, the court of public opinion thought they were botching this investigation. I can imagine a defense attorney jumping on that and saying, hey, what we all thought at the beginning of this investigation is true, and here are all the different reasons why it's not Bryan Kohberger, why it's this person or that person. Don't forget, even Terry was saying, why are the police letting so many people go so quickly?
The surveillance will definitely be a hot topic at trial. The original misidentification of the car model year cast significant doubt on the importance of the car as evidence. The footage does not prove Bryan was the driver, as there are many other cars in the area at the time.
Through our tips, through our leads, some of the evidence that came in, we start to identify patterns.
Police now revealing they're going through 22,000 cars that match the search criteria of the one they're looking for, the 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra, like this. The car resembling this grainy image they're now investigating, captured on a gas station security cam taken around 3:45 the morning of the murders. Employees at that gas station telling ABC News they told investigators the car took this route, heading in the direction of the victim's home. But they don't know where it went once it left the camera's view. Officers believe the occupants of the Elantra they're searching for have information critical to the investigation and are pleading to the public for help.
If we get the word out there, hey, maybe your neighbor has one in the garage that they don't drive very often. Maybe that there's one that's just not on the registration database, let us know.
Moscow police want to talk to the people who were in a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra seen near 1122 King Road, where the murders happened, around the time of the crime. These are stock images of the car, not the actual car itself. Police say they don't know the license plate number, but received tips leading them to ask for the public's help finding the car and the people who were in it. Moscow PD believes they may have critical information about the brutal killings of the 4 University of Idaho students.
Police have confirmed that white Hyundai Elantra has been found.
And I will say that we have found an Elantra.
Wait a minute!
We do know that the FBI initially misidentified the Hyundai Elantra. If it was in fact Bryan Kohberger's car, the police initially identified what they saw on camera as the wrong model year vehicle.
Or something. Not that we want criminals to do better, but you know what I mean. I also know that on numerous occasions, subjects will surveil an area where they intend to commit a crime prior to the date of the crime. Depending on circumstances, this could be done a few days before or for several months prior to the commission of a crime. During these types of surveillance, it's possible that an individual would not leave their cellular telephone at a separate location or turn it off since they do not plan to commit the offense on that particular day. On December 23rd, 2022, I applied for and was granted a search warrant, this is going to be interesting, for historical phone records between November 12th, 2022 at 12 a.m. and November 14th at 12 a.m. for the 8458 phone held by the phone provider AT&T. Approximately 24 hours preceding and following the times of the homicides. These records also included historical cell site location information for the 8458 phone. After receiving this information, I consulted with an FBI special agent that is certified as a member of the Cellular Analysis Survey Team, CAST.
Here's a number.
What's that shit say?
Psych! That's the wrong number!
These are the types of details between the model years that are allowing them to make that type of specific identification. Then there was a reason why they initially thought it was this one vehicle.
That is allegedly on that sheet because he committed the murders versus they're saying, you guys, none of this, there's no other evidence here. That's the only thing. And you know what's kind of weird with this case, and it's kind of like ironic, is that here, DNA all these years has exonerated people, right? Like they've got people on in cases, and then the innocence process comes along because DNA has just made so many advances, and now DNA's people that even falsely confessed, they're being exonerated because of DNA. And here, this with this case, it's like DNA is the only thing that's about to convict somebody, and it's not. And then the way that you obtain it, that's all secretive. And this is the only thing. So they talk about.
Oh, and then by the way, we have Curtis. We're gonna blame old Curdy over here. You know, these two guys, just at the same. They were just running. Who instructed them to do this? But WSU officer Curtis was looking. So Daniel Tenego, at least he's smart enough to say, I don't need to drive around. I'm just gonna go like this. Okay, these are all the ones that are listed. This is all the ones that we have. Here, Curtis is like, I'm just gonna drive around and look for these white Hyundai Elantras. And he happened to locate one while he was looking for it. He happened to locate it in 2015. Curtis, when you were working that day, did anybody tell you to look for that car? You just happened to be driving around, and 20 minutes after the inquiry happened by Daniel Tenego, did he radio into you like, hey, can you go on over there and check it out? No. How many other white Elantras did you find that day since you were out, driving around for them? Did you find any other ones? No, that's the only one I came across.
There are tens of thousands of white Hyundai Elantras in this area. There are many, many vehicles that could have potentially been the suspect vehicle. We have not seen these surveillance videos and so forth that the FBI has relied on to make these claims of being able to track it and so forth. We don't know what their methodology is. We don't know how strong it is. Surveillance footage of the car approximately 50 miles south in Clarkston, Washington, in an Albertsons parking lot can certainly corroborate his location there at that particular point in time. But that car is not traced on video in an uninterrupted fashion back to the King Road killings. And this just comes back to the fact that we don't know what the FBI relied on, what their methodology was to be able to make these claims that it's looking at the same vehicle, that the vehicle is moving in a certain way. The defense also has identified in some of their briefing in the court filings that at least some of the information that the FBI relied on to make this identification showed this vehicle going in the wrong way on one of the primary roads out there. What the footage shows is potentially something associated with the murder, potentially not. The footage does not show Bryan Kohberger, and as far as we can tell, the footage doesn't give us a clear enough identification of that vehicle for us to be able to say definitively, yes, that is Bryan Kohberger's car. There are other Hyundai Elantras that are within this model year that exist in that neighborhood, let alone other white sedans that are driven by other people in that neighborhood. So again, to be able to pin this on Bryan Kohberger that's definitively his car, the state's certainly going to try to do that. But whether that's going to be enough to be able to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that because of some grainy surveillance footage that therefore this is Bryan Kohberger's vehicle, that's going to be a bit of a more difficult sell.
Bryan Kohberger arrives in Idaho, which he has. What will be the police's job on the case?
One of the things I'm very interested in as a forensic science guy is that car. That vehicle would have gone or has gone to an evidence processing location that has a garage, Jesse. And right now, they are taking this thing apart from stem to stern. Trust me on this. And they are going through that car because I have contended all along that this car, obviously it's going to have Kohberger's DNA in it. You would expect that to be there. But if they get in that car and they find any DNA that's associated with these poor kids that were slaughtered in that house, this is important. My contention has been is that car is a rolling crime scene in and of itself. So they're going to take this thing apart piece by piece, and they're going to use every kind of technology that you can imagine on this thing, everything from alternative lighting to luminol or blue star or whatever they're using. They're going to take samples from all inside of this thing. The headliner's coming out, the seats are coming out, everything, the gear lever. They're going to take a look at the carpet, the substrata beneath the carpet, everything, because it doesn't matter how hard you try to clean one of these things, you are not going to escape what we're capable of doing in forensics and recovering molecular evidence.
There's also newly released DNA evidence, which shows no DNA from any of the 4 murder victims that was found in Kohberger's home or car.
The second aspect of surveillance revolves around the cell phone data used to place Bryan at the scene of the crime around the time of the murders. There are limitations in rural areas with low cell tower density. Bryan could have easily just driven out of range.
Again, I don't particularly think this evidence is as strong as you're saying, and part of that is because I have the advantage of living in this area of the country. This is a rural area. I'm quite familiar with it. And so cell tower density is not there like it is in, a city like Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or something like that. Those types of dense cell phone configurations allow fairly precise tracking of cell phones because the location of the cell phone can be triangulated from the pings off of multiple towers. In an area like Moscow, Idaho, this is an area where you might only have a single cell tower that covers a range of 100 square miles or so. So the precision that you get from a single cell phone connection to a single cell tower does not tell you much at all. One of the things that we know from the probable cause affidavit as well is that police obtained a cell tower dump from that tower that was near the King Road residence. So the defense is also going to be able to point out, here's the other hundreds, potentially thousands of people who were also pinging off of this phone, off of this tower within that time frame. So it doesn't particularly give you a precise view of where Bryan Kohberger's location was at any given point in time. And Bryan Kohberger has acknowledged in his kind of alibi, not alibi, if you will, that he was in fact out driving around that night. This is a Saturday night. These are college towns. That's not unusual behavior for a person to be engaged in. And again, the police have theorized that a possible explanation for this is that Mr. Kohberger turned off his cell phone during the time frame that the murders were committed, suggesting he's a sophisticated type of perpetrator. He would know how to hide his tracks. Well, one has to wonder why a sophisticated perpetrator like this would bring his cell phone at all, let alone drive to the scene in his own vehicle, which could then be identified. So this explanation of Mr. Kohberger as kind of both the most organized and disorganized killer at the same time doesn't really line up with a coherent theory of this case. But again, part of the issue with the cell tower density here is that it is not difficult to get out of cell phone range in this area. And that is another perfectly viable explanation for why Mr. Kohberger's cell phone was no longer connecting to these particular towers. If Mr. Kohberger is driving out in the area of, say, Moscow Mountain, it would absolutely be expected that his cell phone was going to lose connectivity with the towers in that area. It's starting to become mountainous, and again, the density is very low. So this is a common occurrence in this type of area that I think folks in the community of Moscow are going to understand and relate to, because they have lost their cell signal driving on these roads before, whereas folks from more denser urban communities may not be able to necessarily relate to that.
One of the most controversial aspects of the case revolves around the surviving roommates. Why did they wait so long to call 911? Why does the defense claim Bethany Funk, claiming exculpatory evidence? And just how strong was the description given by Dylan Mortensen? Could she even picture Bryan out of a lineup?
Who called 911? We're learning that the caller was not, repeat, not either of the two roommates who live in the house and apparently slept through the massacre. So the mystery is, who did make that 911 call to police, and how did that person make the gruesome discovery? I spoke with County Prosecutor Bill Thompson.
It's an essential part of the case. Whoever discovered the scene first, whoever initiated the contact with law enforcement is all part of understanding what occurred and the timeline of what occurred.
Tonight, a bumpy start to a lengthy court battle from the defense team of alleged Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger. His team attempting to force the surviving housemate of the Forest Lane University of Idaho students to testify in his defense at a preliminary hearing in June. According to an affidavit, Funk was in a first-floor bedroom of the apartment house during the early morning of the murders on November 13th. A criminal investigator for Kohberger's defense writes that Funk has information that is, quote, exculpatory to the defendant, and adds it's, quote, unique to her experiences and cannot be provided by another witness.
One reason the defense may want to call this witness is they have some reason to believe that she'll testify inconsistently with what she's told police in the past. If that were to happen while she's under oath, that would be a really big benefit to the defense, because now they'll have something to cross-examine her with at trial.
Funk and the other surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, have not spoken publicly about the case. We don't know what Funk saw or didn't see, but clearly the defense finds it beneficial to their case. Here's what we know about the other roommate, Dylan Mortensen. A police report says the morning of the murders, she woke up to voices and saw a suspect walking past her with a mask on. The defense, as of now, not calling on her, but we'll see how this plays out in court.
The difficulty with this description that Dylan gave is that it is very vague. There are probably going to be, again, thousands of people, young men who are 5'10" or older, taller, who could potentially meet this description. Again, this was known as a party house. From what we know about how things were done there, it seems like it was pretty common for people to be coming and going at really all hours of the night.
Didn't they say that at trial, Ms. Mortensen, is Bryan Kohberger the man that you saw that night? Couldn't they ask her that?
Oh, they can certainly ask that at trial, and the defense is going to point out she knows exactly who she's supposed to identify in this courtroom. That's why you do a photo lineup series where it is blindly administered. and there is no suggestion to the witness as to who is the right person to identify. It makes it a much cleaner identification that isn't tainted.
One of the most important aspects of the case revolves around the DNA, specifically DNA found on a knife sheath. Often described as touch DNA, a better description would be trace DNA, because it is basically just an extremely low level of cells found on the knife. There are a number of ways your DNA can end up on an object that's considered trace DNA, such as touching the object or touching a person who then touches the object. The absence of a connection between Bryan Kohberger and any of the people in the house, paired with the lack of DNA evidence found in Bryan's car, apartment, or family home, raises some serious questions.
Yeah, so the DNA evidence, you've described it as strong. I would describe it as really the linchpin of the state's case, because if this DNA evidence does not stand, in my opinion, the case does not stand. So it's really the only hope that they have to get a conviction here. What we know about the DNA is that it appears to be what we call trace evidence, meaning this doesn't come directly from a body fluid like a blood or something like that that can help explain how that DNA got onto that knife sheath. Instead, it is simply a small amount of what is likely DNA associated with skin cells, or sometimes there's not even any cellular material at all. It's simply free-floating DNA.
According to this unsealed affidavit of probable cause, first, an Idaho lab located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of a knife sheath next to one of the stabbing victims.
Which, if you don't know, is brass. Studies show successful recovery of touch DNA from plastic, glass, and wood. However, studies have found difficulty in recovering DNA from certain types of metal, such as brass and copper. Brass showed the strongest inhibitory impact, followed by zinc with copper, 10 to 40 times less inhibitory. Brass and zinc also caused higher DNA degradation than copper. Scientists suggested that metal cations interact directly or indirectly with the negatively charged phosphate backbone of DNA, as well as the nitrogen or positive atoms of the nucleobase, allowing the formation of ionic bonds that may impede the release of touch DNA from metal surfaces. That interaction may explain, to some extent, the poor DNA recovery from metal substrates, along with the presently inconsistent success rate between 0 and 26%. Oh, and did I mention that that DNA on brass would only be viable for 4 hours max, yet the cops weren't called until 8 hours later? And your forensics team didn't show up until 4 hours after the first 8. So we're looking at 12 hours.
Science rules. So what we know now is that this type of DNA is very easily transferred, not just from person to object, but from person to person, person to person to object, person to person to person. It could be direct touch, but it's not required to be direct touch. It could be somebody shook Bryan Kohberger's hand the night before and then touched this knife blade. That type of thing has been established to lead to the transfer of a trace DNA like this. It can simply be talking, having a conversation in a room, not touching anything at all. Your DNA can end up in measurable amounts on items like this.
Then it was the real killer who had touched Bryan Kohberger, or it might have been one of the victims who had shook Bryan Kohberger's hand and then touched that knife sheath.
The degree of the connection is something that the defense has also challenged in their filings. We know that that's coming because of the way that these statistics are performed. They are calculated in a manner that is not consistent with the reality of the population at large, and it allows the creation of these overinflated numbers that make this sound like a more precise match than in fact it is.
We start off this hour in the state of Idaho, where Bryan Kohberger's defense team is pushing back and pushing back hard, let me tell you, against DNA evidence that allegedly places him at the scene of that quadruple homicide. Now, the state of Idaho has revealed through court documents that Bryan Kohberger is a statistical match to DNA recovered from the knife sheath found at the scene of the crime, saying in part, quote, "We already knew that Kohberger's father was linked to the knife sheath. The FBI further compared DNA from the sheath to a cheek swab of the defendant and determined it was a match." Now, Kohberger's attorneys are responding to the claims, accusing the state of Idaho of hiding its entire case. And there's more. And they're rejecting the notion that they are expected to just accept at face value that the sheath contained touch DNA belonging to Bryan Kohberger. So the defense team goes on to say, quote, "There's no connection between Mr. Kohberger and the victims. There is no explanation for the total lack of DNA evidence from the victims in Mr. Kohberger's apartment, in his office, in his home, or his vehicle."
That aside, we do know that Bryan Kohberger had at least some nominal contacts with law enforcement, because we know that he had applied for an internship with the Washington State University Police. We don't know if that internship was ever granted or not, but also he is a criminology student. He is working in this area. So there are potential nexuses there between Bryan Kohberger and potentially the investigators who ended up at the scene. But again, because this evidence can be so easily transferred, it doesn't require that Bryan Kohberger directly contacted any one of the victims for his DNA to end up at the scene. He could have simply been out at a bar the night before on a Saturday night in a college town where some of the other college students would have been present. That is enough and has been demonstrated to be enough for this type of thing to take place.
Now, the defense team in their motion has said some other things. They're saying, quote, in part, lab analysts were aware of 2 additional males' DNA within the house where the deceased were located, and another unknown male's DNA on a glove found outside the residence. Further, these 3 separate and distinct male DNA profiles were not identified through CODIS, that's the big national system where you can do legal comparisons, leading to the conclusion that the profiles do not belong to Mr. Kohberger.
The defense's job is to find an argument and some evidence to back it up that can go to support reasonable doubt. The standard in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, and so the defense has got to do their best to try to create some argument that a jury would be convinced, okay, this is reasonable doubt. The government did not investigate these other sources of DNA.
The problem with DNA evidence isn't so much the fact that it exists, it's explaining how it got there. And with something like blood in a murder setting, there's a pretty strong inference that you have to draw that means the person was present and bled on the item from which the blood was recovered. With trace DNA, that argument simply doesn't follow. There are too many ways for that potential evidence to end up on a sheath like that knife. There is a massive amount of forensic science that has been done on this topic. The defense is going to have experts who can come in and explain how all of this works to the jury. You can be sure that the jury is going to hear about this Lucas Anderson case, who, as it turned out, his DNA was found underneath the fingernails of a murder victim, and the defense was subsequently later able to tie that to his having been treated by paramedics, first responders, shortly before they then responded to the crime scene and handled this body.
Brigida, let's talk about the case of Lucas Anderson. How did his own DNA frame him for murder?
In 2012, a homeless alcoholic man named Lucas Anderson was charged with first-degree murder when his DNA was found on the body of a murder victim who had been killed in a home invasion. Now, his DNA was specifically on the murder victim's fingernails. And the way that they got there was through a process called secondary transfer. All that means is that as humans, we leave our cells everywhere we go. In fact, we shed about 50 million skin cells per day. And those cells, our DNA, can then get picked up and moved around by a third party. So that's all that means. It turns out that on the night of this murder, Lucas Anderson had been passed out drunk in a hospital. Now, he could not remember where he was that night, so police, when they asked him about his whereabouts, he said he had no recollection. He also had a previous history and one conviction for a home invasion, and that's how this man was murdered. So It did not look good for him, but Public Defender, as she was building his defense, came across some files, including his medical records. And they proved that on that night when the murder was taking place, he was in the hospital. Now, experts believe that his DNA, Anderson's DNA, made its way onto the victim's fingernails through some of the paramedics' equipment, most likely through a finger oxygen reader that they had used on Anderson and then later on used on the victim. And she was able to find out that he was actually innocent of this crime and that he had never met the murder victim or even ever been to the crime scene.
Another major piece of the defense for Bryan Kohberger revolves around the handling of the crime scene. It was absolute chaos, and people were walking in and out constantly. It raises serious questions over the legitimacy of the evidence against Bryan Kohberger.
So there have been numerous instances of cases where false convictions have occurred due to reliance on this type of evidence. Were this an impeccable crime scene, I think your argument would be a lot stronger. But the problem is that there were hours in which various people had access to this scene. We had numerous first responders and investigators and so forth in and out through this scene. So any one of those people is a potential source of transfer DNA. Any one of those people could have potentially been the reason why Bryan Kohberger's DNA ended up on this knife sheath and nowhere else in the residence.
Were they found in beds?
Yes. There were multiple stab wounds. The fatal ones were to the chest area or the upper body area.
Tonight, we're learning more details about the grisly murders in Idaho. Police believe Bryan Kohberger stabbed the students to death between 4 and 4:25 that morning. But after earlier reports, the victims were likely sleeping. New court records show at least one victim, Xana Coronado, was likely awake, getting a DoorDash delivery at 4 a.m.
Sometimes when new information comes forward, the people that we've spoken to beforehand may have new insight on that. So it does often seem like we're backtracking, but we're really just trying to get the most important details and the best timeline that we can come up with.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
You know, there's something that is missing from the probable cause affidavit that jumped out at me immediately, and that is the medical examiner's opinion as to the time of death. The reason why this is important is because the time frame in which these murders occurred, that has been largely reverse engineered by the state from everything that we've seen in the probable cause affidavit. They have simply looked at the correspondence between when were the last time that people were seen, when were they communicating on their cell phones. There was a DoorDash delivery of food at some point in this time frame. There's a lot of pieces that have come together that have led the state, along with the video surveillance of this white vehicle, to take the position that the crime happened at this very specific time frame between about 4:05 and 4:20 in the morning. I would like to know, does that correspond with the medical examiner's estimate of the time of death? That's something that we would have known before the probable cause affidavit was written. I would expect that information to be included in the probable cause affidavit if it confirmed the state's theories of how these murders occurred. So there is going to be a burden on the state to establish the time frame as well, because all of these pieces have to fall into place for Mr. Kohberger to be the suspect that they've identified. And if any one of those pieces falls apart and it turns out maybe there are reasons to think the murder took place an hour earlier, an hour later, then this whole theory of Mr. Kohberger being the perpetrator falls apart.
Another mystery, where was Kaylee's dog the night of the killing? Why didn't his barking wake everyone up?
They have questions about the behavior of Kaylee's dog that was found in the home, but police say there was no indication the animal had entered the crime scene.
If he was locked in a room, I would guess that he would bark and claw and whine.
2 of the roommates surviving unscathed.
Autopsies on the 4 students found each had multiple stab wounds. Some had defensive wounds, showing they fought with the attacker. And there was no sexual assault. County Coroner Kathy Mabbutt is describing the murders as personal.
They want to know if he had a connection to one or more of the victims.
As this case goes to trial, that will be brought forth.
Seems real personal.
I don't think so. It's iconic, planned, and in some ways it was impersonal.
Investigators have not said whether Kohberger knew the victims or why he would have targeted them, and a motive is yet to be revealed.
Well, I think some of that does cut both ways. As you pointed out, the defense has indicated in their court filings there is no evidence of any connection between Bryan Kohberger and these victims, which is a circumstance you would expect from a killing like this if it's a targeted type of killing.
Stephen Gonsalves told Fox News that he spoke with the coroner, Kathy Mabbutt. First off, before we get into the wounds, is it typical for a coroner to share this information with the parent of a victim?
It depends upon the case, and yeah, I mean, I've certainly, in my past, working as a medical legal death investigator, have shared, some of the intimate details when asked specifically about it. However, I will say this: if there has ever been a multiple homicide case that I have worked, I've never done a compare and contrast relative to injuries that other victims have sustained to the wounds that, say, the immediate family is asking me about one victim. That's very bad form.
But this is what Stephen Gonsalves told Fox News about what was told to him by the coroner. She says, "Sir, I don't think stabs is the right word. It was like tears, like this was a strong weapon, not like a stab. She said these things were big open gouges. She said it was quick. These weren't something where you were going to be able to call 911. They were not going to slowly bleed out." What do you make of that?
I've never heard verbiage like that from anyone in the medical legal field, and I'll tell you why.
Wait, does that mean that he might be getting it wrong, or that there's something, if a coroner told this to him, something's off?
Yeah, something would be off, and I don't know, maybe he's not quite understanding what's being said, but he's using very specific language there, Jesse. Tears, let's just break it down real quick, all right? When you're using an edged weapon, tearing is not something that's associated with that, okay? Tearing creates this, where you have connective tissue or you have tissue bridging. Most of the time that's connected with lacerations, and lacerations are associated with blunt force trauma. The coroner's never mentioned anything about blunt force trauma. You have two choices with sharp force injuries. You either have stabs, okay, or you have incised wounds, which are slices. Slices are longer than they are deep. Stabs are deeper than they are long. That's really your only two choices. Now, kind of an outlier in all of this is something we refer to as puncture wounds, which doesn't look anything like a stab wound. They're generally, kind of circular in shape. You see them with people that have been stabbed with shanks, homemade shanks in prisons, or people that are impaled on rebar and that sort of stuff. Now, this tearing, it doesn't add up to me. It doesn't make sense whatsoever.
But we've been under the impression that it was a fixed blade knife that was used. There was reporting that it was a Rambo-style knife. There was questions if it was a K-bar-style knife. He said, Stephen Gonsalves, that the knife slashed open Kaylee Gonsalves' liver and lungs. Again, so are we thinking it's the wrong weapon based on this?
Do you know what possibly means?
Like probably?
No, probably means there's a good chance that we're gone. Possibly means we might not.
The murder weapon police say believed to be a knife has yet to be found.
So I think what you're going to see in this case is that certainly the DNA evidence is a strong piece of evidence for the state, and it's what they're going to rely on. But they're going to have to show how the absence of other circumstances that we would expect to be present if Bryan Kohberger were the killer, how that can be reconciled with their theory of how this killing transpired. And so because of that, it's all the more important that the surrounding circumstances strongly corroborate the state's theory of how these killings occurred. And that is where, in my opinion, The evidence that we have so far is nowhere near at the level that it would need to be to establish Bryan Kohberger's guilt beyond reasonable doubt.
There is a lot of circumstantial evidence that the state is piling up to try to prove this case, and it's the kind of circumstantial evidence that juries usually love. In a day and age where you have CSI, you have true crime, you have all this stuff that people want to see, how are you connecting all these dots? They're using technology, they're using video images, they're using cell phone pings, they're using DNA evidence, all to connect Bryan Kohberger to this case. What they're missing is motive. What they're missing is some arguments of, could there have been another person? Is there someone else with motive and opportunity to have potentially committed this crime? So I wouldn't say it's a slam dunk. So that's what you call a slam dunk when you have video of the defendant actually committing the crimes, right? That's what you call a slam dunk. Are there holes in this evidence? How solid is this evidence that we've read in a probable cause affidavit and it sounds good when a law enforcement officer is explaining it with no cross-examination and no experts on the other side?
Thanks for watching. I hope I could answer some questions about the defense of Bryan Kohberger. Unfortunately, it might be a long wait for trial, as nothing has yet to be scheduled. But at least we can look forward to cameras. As the judge ruled, they'll be streaming on their YouTube channel. As always, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop exploring.
I don't sleep. I just dream.